Okay, again, welcome to this afternoon's keynote, today's keynote, and a couple of Zoom tips to begin. You might want to go ahead in the Zoom to change your name to your institution. Turn on your video if you want, that's up to you, but we do like to see all of the attendees, and if you are so inclined, feel free to turn on your video. Please mute yourself. Connect with colleagues through chat, and don't hesitate to put your questions into chat as we have a conversation this afternoon about international students. So with that said, I am going to turn it over to Andrea, and I will stop my share and go ahead.
Thank you and welcome. On behalf of GRAC, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session today. So we are in the Spring Immigration Workshop, we focus so much on the details of regulation and immigration status and students and sort of get really focus in on that regulatory part. But we wanted to take a minute throughout the day and throughout this week to also acknowledge some of the research that tells us, that puts a human face, and as well as some statistics on who international students are, what's happening, what are the trends that will impact our work. And so it's my great pleasure to have with us today Dr. Chris Glass. He is the Executive Director of the Director of the Executive Doctorate of Education in Higher Ed at Boston College, and he's also Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of International Students that now has some footing here in New England with Dr. Glass's arrival in Boston at BC this past year. And so we wanted to formally welcome you to New England as somebody that's working here right now, and also just give you the floor to talk a little bit about what we should be knowing about international students and the trends that we're seeing. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Andrea. Thanks for the really warm welcome. I'm excited to be in New England and to share today with you. I'm excited to be at Boston College and affiliated faculty with the Center for International Higher Education, and do my work at Boston College related to their Executive EdD program. Andrea and I talked, and I'm going to highlight at the very beginning and end if you want to connect. I'm very happy to do that. In fact, I'll go ahead and even put my email in the chat box. Definitely want you to feel free to reach out to me if something I say today sparks questions. Really, in the 45 minutes or so that we don't have time to cover everything, and I would love to get to know the people in the region and make connections, as well as to spark conversations about my work. That's the best kind of conversation to have, is one that really begins a conversation. So you can find me on the web or on Twitter or on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out. So when we planned the session, we wanted to make sure that recognize that this would be a great chance to have a conversation. We want it to be interactive, so we have plenty of time for question and answer. So we'll spend about half the session with me providing some overview ideas and comments related to major trends in research on international students. And but I want to make sure to mention that if you do have a question, feel free to pop that in the chat box, and especially if you want to stop and take a moment and us to focus on that question. I'm very happy to do that. Other than that, we'll definitely leave some time for question and answer at the end, and certainly ways for you to share some of your own contributions. You might notice the third bullet point is asking you what resources you have to share. And so you might have some resources that pop to mind as I'm covering some of the trends that we see in the research. And we want to make sure that you can, we take advantage of the group that is assembled here today to share your knowledge as well. And so be thinking about that as well. So this is going to go in three parts. The first is really, what trends do we see in the research? How can I learn more about these topics? I'll provide some practical resources related to that, a chance for you to share some resources, and then a time for question and answer. So first, let's talk about the major trends in research on international students. One of the things I think, like the introduction highlights, is I want to say a few things about my background just to help you understand why I might know something about this. I am the editor for the Journal of International Students. We are the largest and most cited journal in international education, and we're also also very proudly open access, which means all of our research is free and accessible to the public, which sounds like it's good news to those in Massachusetts, but it's really great news to those scholars that are in the global South or may not be at research universities that have access to major library subscriptions. That means we're far more representative in terms of what we think about in terms of the trends with international students. And we're much more inclusive in terms of the authors that are publishing in our journal. And so we are really proud to be inclusive and open access in that way. Secondly, I am also, and I'll highlight this, editing a book series for Rutledge on the future of academic mobility. We're looking at global student mobility from different perspectives. We have published 7 books in this series so far. And we have another 13 or so in the pipeline along the way. So I've had the good fortune of working with many of the leading scholars, authors, researchers, those that are looking at major trends that we see with international student research. I don't always know all the answers to every single question, but I certainly know who would know those answers if we get to those today. With the journal, we've been focusing on 3 major areas. We're looking to publish high impact cross-border research. We're engaging in more digital storytelling and multimedia, but we're also looking for the voices of new generations of scholars. So we're looking for new voices in the field. But when we thought about the trends, we actually did a poll. We reached out to all of our subscribers and we asked about the kinds of topics that they thought were important when we think about today's international students. Often the field has focused for decades, really since its inception, about questions of adaptation, acculturation, assimilation, integration, those kinds of questions. But there have been recently, I think, a trend towards new kinds of questions, especially as we think about the broader global context that international student mobility is taking place in. And we brought some of these to our readers. We thought maybe they would highlight 1 or 2 that they thought were the hot topic, and we would know which are the hot topics to focus on. But actually, these were the 6 topics, and almost to the equal extent, these are things that people are very interested in as it relates to international student mobility, and they'll have major implications for your role in working with international students, particularly. The first is related to concerns related to global climate change and sustainability. There are real concerns related to the sustainability of cross-border mobility that requires physical a movement of a person on an airplane from location to location. And certainly this is a hot area of research. Second is decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation. There is a lot of concern. I'll highlight some resources and projects I've been in part with about the types of historic relationships that have shaped mobility patterns and how those manifest themselves in racial relations on campus, students' experiences on campus, and in ways in which practitioners, educators, and students themselves are acting as change, looking to provide a more inclusive kind of campus environment and form of international education. The third hot topic, and just did a seminar here with the Center for International Higher Education on this, is on virtual mobility and virtual exchange. It's actually quite difficult right now to quantify the number of students that are participating in international programs. If you're familiar with the Open Doors report, I'm sure you've all read it when it came out. It had a very interesting footnote. One of the most interesting parts of that report was how IIE decided to count international students, because they did include students who were studying at a distance. They didn't say how long they were going to do that or exactly how that was how that might factor into future trends, in part because it's very difficult to think about how we measure, how we think about this new form of virtual mobility. In the webinar that we highlighted, virtual mobility is used in different parts of the world to gain access to higher education, but it's also designed to provide exchange between countries. Certainly questions that are front and center at this week's sessions related to immigration politics, policy, and human rights. This has certainly been exacerbated and gotten far more attention with the kinds of drastic changes we've seen in rhetoric and policy related to international students in the United States, but it also has been a long time coming. As you probably know, and I highlight in a report I did for the American Council on Education, the peak enrollment growth related to international students really peaked out about 2016. This is pre some of these, the change in kind of rhetoric and types of rules that people often point to. And so these trends aren't just about the politics of today or the politics of the moment that you might find in the newspaper. They really are about long-term trends. And I've documented this in a study that I did with 20 years of data from UNESCO, where I look at overall kind of network trends from 1999, pre-9/11, to 2019. Next is related to, as we think about cross-cultural mental health and well-being, these continue to be front and center, in part because if you've seen the Chronicle of Higher Education, there's considered to be a mental health crisis right now on American colleges and campuses. College and universities can often be the places where mental health issues become exacerbated, or they become visible for many students. And this certainly includes international students. But the very important thing to highlight about this trend that I think is very important is there is a desire and a very intentional effort for people to not necessarily place the burden of a mental health issue on that student who's experiencing that issue, but they're trying to focus on more positive framings in terms of resilience and positive psychology, but also recognizing that mental health issues can often be a symptom of a racial climate that's inhospitable, where the issue is not the person who's exhibiting the issue, but the issue is the campus environment itself, and trying to reframe some of that in the research. Transnational lives, employment, and careers. As you would probably well know, this is really front and center. It used to be that individuals were satisfied with traveling across borders for an education, for a diploma, for a degree. More often, their international students are looking to immigrate to locations and destinations where there's a sense that there is real upward mobility related to employment. This certainly is partly because of the growing in diversity and the socioeconomic profile of international students, but also reflects the premium on finding employability, to believe if you've seen some of the data that has come from students who've studied in the United States from China and returned, some of the anecdotal evidence where the premium that's often been placed on getting an international degree isn't always evident in some of the outcomes we see with international students. So these are the big topic areas, and we call these critical conversations on international students. And I want to highlight real quickly, I'm going to try to pop back and forth every once in a while to our website to be able to highlight where that is, and actually we'll do that in just a second, because I will. Let me see if I can quickly, here we go to the website. I want to highlight where you can find some of these as resources if you're looking to learn more. If you go here to browse our journal and you browse by topic, you'll see that actually one of the resources that we've created for our readers is that these would be organized by topic, where we highlight some of the most cited pieces related to some of the topics that I just talked about. In terms of other trends with international student research, we've explicated these a little bit more in the aims and scope. We just updated this, but I do want to highlight a couple things that are important in terms of how we think about international students. One is looking at more intersectional approaches, trying to not always use country of identification as a sole way to differentiate international student groups from one another, but looking at intersectional identities. Those identities can be the family profile that the student is coming from in terms of their academic goals and careers. It could be the language they speak, the gender they identify with. the sexual orientation that they experience. And so we're actively seeking more and more research related to these areas because these are under-researched areas and they have profound impacts on a student's adjustment and acculturative processes. And so we've been focusing on that. Another thing you might notice is that we focus a lot on the politics of belonging. Of what it means to belong, who belongs, who is able who belongs on campus. And one of the things we're doing in terms of research is we're being very intentional in terms of centering the perspectives of women, people of color, and communities from the global South. And we're particularly looking at new ways to understand international student experiences. We're just about to release, I really encourage you to check this out, an autoethnographic exploration where we have about 12 different students that are providing intersectional perspectives on their own experiences, looking at multiple identities and what that means for them as an international student. That's a good example of something that's very different than thinking you just need to have these 3 factors, and if they're in place, the student's going to be adjusted or is going to experience successful acculturative processes. These are going to be really rich stories. They're part of our digital storytelling initiative that will provide much more nuanced kind of pictures of international students. So that's where the field is going. It's also diversifying quite rapidly. I know the primary audience today is located in the United States, but I would say that the greatest growth of our journal actually is happening quite around the world as we work with some scholars in different parts. We've published different issues in other languages. Bahasa Indonesian, we published in that, one in Chinese. We've published in any number of languages. We have one in Spanish that's coming up, in part because there are often things about the international student experience, and this is what is relevant, I think, to the group here. There's often things about the international student experience that aren't easily captured in the English language. And so often it's valuable to ask a student, what is a word that best expresses your experience? Often that word doesn't have an easy translation into an English kind of parallel. It might be a metaphor, it might be a idiom, it might be something that a mother says to her child growing up again and again, or a teacher says in the classroom. And these having multiple languages that are used to express the international student experience of acculturation, adaptation, and adjustment really enriches the field. And also it means more people are involved in the conversation, and that conversation is centered around topics that might not be ones that we're prioritizing here in the United States and the West, but are quite important. In fact, our largest day of downloads was from our Indonesian issue that we did. We got hundreds of thousands of hits on that day, almost crashed our website. We've also embraced more, and I'm going to show you some resources that you might be interested in exploring, more critical perspectives on internationalization. Certainly, we're all in the field in part because we understand the benefits of international students on campus, the benefits it can provide to those students, to our campuses, to students who aren't going to be crossing a border, but can meet somebody who's crossed that border in their classroom or in their co-curricular event or in their study abroad or in their leadership program. We know the benefits, but those who are involved with critical internationalization studies highlight the kind of historic relationships that make some of those dynamics challenging. And I'm going to highlight some resources if you're interested in that kind of research. Certainly with the Rutledge series, you can see similar kinds of patterns. And what's great, this is a great time to be studied international students because there's so much research that's being done. You can see that obviously, I think the book series and the ones that most recently highlight some of the trends I've already talked about. There's interest in new generations of students who are traveling from different parts of the world. You can see that from our international student mobility to and from the Middle East. But we also see there's there's a desire to learn more about non-traditional destinations. A lot of what we know about international students comes from large research universities because that's where the researchers are located that are often doing this research. And we have more related to the experiences of international students at US community colleges, as well as critical perspectives and and trying to understand the potential impact of the COVID pandemic. So how can you learn more about these topics? I wanted to highlight some resources. Andrea and I came up with a couple resources that we thought would be helpful to everyone. The first is certainly the journal. And I hope you see it, and I put the website link at the bottom, jisstudents.org. The reason I say that is it's free, it's open access. Very few journals are free and open access. They're often behind a paywall. You have to go through a library subscription. But this is really one of the best resources that is going to help you be able to get access information related to current trends with international students. If I could, I'm going to quickly go here to, sorry, I need to jump around to my, I'm going to show you on our website, the way you would do that is simply, if you're looking for a topic, you can just click the search button on the far right and then type your topic that you're looking for. That's a valuable way to quickly get some information in that respect. The other thing I would also like to highlight is recently I did a report with the American Council on Education, and this is for further reading. This could be its own session, that was the American Council on Education was looking to make a substantive contribution to what do we know about research on international students. And they commissioned me to write, it's a 60-page report. But I think what's valuable to particularly people that are involved in practice is this is not just a academic paper. This has a lot of how-to types of call-outs and things that you can reach out to. And you can see. Let me see if I can pull up a copy of the report and highlight what this would look like. So there's checklists. There's things like, what should you include in your messages to international students when they are arriving on your campuses? What are examples of institutions that have really effective practices? How does this align with approaches to comprehensive internationalization and international student success? So there is a large smorgasbord of checklists, of examples, of best practices in the field that we have synthesized here. So it's not simply even an academic paper like I've been highlighting so much with some of this other research. It has very much of a how-to type of focus that allows you to think about, okay, is our campus doing the kinds of things that are going to make sure that we're a welcoming place for international students? We're a place where international students are going to belong. And what I like about this report, and that's quite different, is it takes a life cycle approach. This is something that's actually quite difficult to find. And so the reason it was commissioned is, how do we think about international students from the very moment we make contact at maybe a recruiting fair abroad, to the way that we welcome them on a pre-campus orientation, to how we take care of arrival, how we experience the life cycle process, provide appropriate career services, and we make sure that they have successful employability outcomes at the end. It looks at that really from the very first point of contact, and looks to build a lifelong relationship. That's why we emphasize embarking on a lifelong relationship. How can we not look at international students in a transactional sense, but look at them as true students that we're trying to build lifelong relationships with from the very point that we first connect with them throughout the student life cycle. And it offers, I think, some really powerful recommendations for how to create this kind of inclusive environment, but it also does ground it in some values, I think, that are very important. It looks at the ways in which international students are changing. I always talk about these as being the demographics of international students are changing, the destinations where international students are changing, the forms of delivery of the kinds of programs that international students are engaged on our campus are changing as well. And so this is where our international students are changing, and we should think about ways in which our institutions can change as well. The other resource I would share with you is recently Jenny Lee, who's a scholar at the University of Arizona, and a lot of the major people in the field who are looking at these issues wrote a really powerful book that's received quite a bit of press and has won a number of awards called U.S. Power in International Higher Education. This gets back to what I was talking about earlier when I talked about critical perspectives on international student mobility in higher education. And there are a number of chapters that are related to ways in which we need to understand historic power dynamic kinds of relations that might affect the international student experience. And it's available from Rutgers University Press. If you're not already familiar with it, I would definitely recommend, would recommend this resource, which is UNESCO, excuse me, I'm sorry, UNESCO, there we go. UNESCO has Reimagining Our Futures Together. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but this is a very substantial project. This is not just a project where they published a report, they commissioned, someone like me or a group of a blue ribbon panel to write some kind of paper. They engaged in literally thousands of interviews with hundreds of individuals across hundreds of countries, whether that be on social media, and they involved students, they involved leaders, they involved employers, they involved faculty members, and they were looking to how can we reimagine the role of education when we think about the kinds of challenges we face in the world. And they published this recently in a monograph called Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. I think it's one of the most provocative and forward-thinking views of education and the challenges that we face as educators in the decades ahead. I think the report, the report has some very provocative language that is worth serious consideration among all. If you have a heartbeat, if you're a part of the human race, it's something that deserves serious consideration, particularly those of us in international education, because they talk about the need to think about international education for a world that is facing existential challenges in the years ahead. Certainly, we see that with the coronavirus pandemic, and we see that with Russia's war with Ukraine. But they point to a looming threat that I think all of us will be talking about far more in the years ahead in international higher education, which is the threat for catastrophic climate change, and what that means for our field, our profession, and how we need to prepare today. Because universities are not just responding to a changing world, universities are changing that world. And it's really important, I think, to engage with some of these perspectives to think about our role with that. A couple of bookmarks I would offer as well, and I can try to put this in the chat as well. The University of Minnesota, if you're looking for really great best practices, they put together a fantastic resource. This is a multi-page book as it relates to how do we have best practices in terms of integrating international and domestic students. There is another great, it's a little bit of older resource, a bit outdated, or it's a bit dated, but the Center for Global Education has a list of ways, if you're looking for examples of programs of you're going to do career development or community outreach or domestic mentoring, peer-to-peer mentoring partners, dealing with issues of academic plagiarism and integrity. It's tons and tons of resources of practices that you can see and reach out to your colleagues at those institutions. And certainly the American Council on Education really has probably the most comprehensive and best set of tools for insights and practices that relates to working with international students. And this could be anything from the curriculum or co-curriculum and onward. Certainly, subscribing and learning from the Journal of International Students is a great resource. The other resource I would really commend to you, I'm a big fan of open access, as you can probably already tell, is the International Higher Education, which is the oldest and longest standing journal on international higher education, published by the Center for International Higher Education here at Boston College. And certainly want to highlight that as well. So that's a quick summary of the types of issues that I see from my desk. But I want to make sure that there's a chance for all of you to share some of the resources that you have to share. So if you'd like to take a moment and put those in the chat box, if there are some resources that you think are really valuable, and then we'll turn it to some question and answer. And I know you have a session at 2 o'clock, and so we will We will wrap up here about 1/4 till the hour or 10 till the hour at the latest, based on the kinds of questions that people have for us to discuss today. But what resources do you have that you would like to share? The resources I focused on were examples of collections of best practices, collections related to new trends in international students, new ways and kind of paradigms and perspectives that are being used, practical materials, but feel free to put in the chat box anything that you rely on at your institution to when you're working with international students. Okay. Well, we can continue with that, but why don't we just open it up to question and answer at this point? People can type their questions in the chat box, and we can definitely do this in an interactive way because my guess is often the people who are in the room are often people who can offer valuable and diverse perspectives on the questions that we talk about, and will certainly enrich my perspective, which is just one of a few billion that could be offered. And so certainly I think we would be enriched by hearing everyone's perspective on the kinds of questions that you might have related to trends in research on international students, where you would find that research, topics that are important, data sources you might be looking to. I'd be interested to hear any questions or engage with those.
Thank you so much for pointing us in the direction of some key resources to look at how the field of international education can move towards better serving the international students that we have in ways that are beyond just the immigration component. I wanted to read Emma's question here, so would love to hear a little bit more about how research, research is increasingly complicated, the notion of international, and a lot of the storytelling at our institutions. Would love to hear some of the examples of the type of research that's happening.
Yeah, let's see, around intersex. Thanks, Emma, for talking about the intersectional work and expanding a bit on that. So I think the desire, I think and I really appreciate your emphasis on storytelling. It's actually, you might, at the very beginning of the presentation, it's a major push that we're making with the journal. Stories can be incredibly, as persuasive, or if not more persuasive, than just raw data. And I think it's really important that we do a better job of not just providing the data, but telling the story behind students' experiences. It really gives a concrete example of what can lead to institutional change. We often think if we have, an N of 1,000 or 2,000, if we can only add 10,000 people, we could persuade. But often one powerful story can be as powerful as a large data set. The intersectional work that is primarily going on, as I see it, are in probably two areas. One is an area that is front and center for a lot of students, which are the racialized experiences they're having on our campuses. These have often not been given the proper voice that as they've encountered different social identities that they didn't know that they were they had or had to negotiate in terms of their onboarding process. This certainly has a lot to do with, and we talked about in our call, the experiences of Asian students who are experiencing hate and finding other types of discrimination, but the ways those intersect with other forms of identity. For example, the the issue that we have addresses specifically when a student discovers and reconsiders their sexual orientation while abroad, and how that intersects with their race. So certainly issues that are related to race and the kind of identities, especially in the American context, are what we see the most work related to that. And then I think particularly the other thing I would say is a major focus right now. I think it's gotten attention, but I don't think it's gotten the attention it deserves, which is culture is not limited to nation. Culture is often, especially in a kind of a globalized world, culture can often be connected to class. And it's very possible that a student who travels from a different nation but comes from the same class as a domestic student could have more in common based on that class identification than students that are coming from different social classes and then encountering a university environment. Not much has really been, a growing body of work is looking at the role that socioeconomic status and social class plays in the international student experience, particularly as it relates to their goals. What does this mean for their education? Who they relate to? What professors they connect with? How they feel like they have a sense of belonging? What their goals are? What kind of career services they're hoping for? What their plans for immigration are? These have not always been unpacked as we've thought about social class, and particularly with families making great sacrifices. That immigration decision for the international student is about that family, not just the student. And so that is another way I see it. I see, or Andrea, do you want to read the next one, or do you want me to?
Yeah, sure. So Susanna's question has to do with research around cross-cultural wellness and behavioral health, particularly post-COVID. And the question, she would like to be able to share some nuanced perspectives with the administration beyond just saying that students need to go to the counseling center. So do you have any insight on the research around that topic?
Yeah, so I would certainly at that point recommend going to the journal's website. We have any number of studies that have been done on different student populations that would give you rich qualitative data related to students' experiences of mental health. One that is often not talked about in addition to COVID, that I think is a big part of COVID, is the experience of grief. We had a wonderful a rich exploration of that in, I think, the last in the last issue of 2021, where the distance grief, it's as international students wrestle with grieving a loved one who might be abroad when they could or couldn't return home, or their various kinds of traditions they may or may not be able to participate in. I think persuading or communicating about this is often trying to think about these case examples and highlighting that there are ways that counseling centers can be more responsive to that. So I think there's, I would say look at the different articles. In fact, I think we have a whole section I want to make sure to highlight real quickly so I can provide a good resource. So if you go here, there are several, I provided the direct link here in terms of the various ways that these are approached. You'll see that there are examples of how Chinese international students use mental health services, thinking through a model for college readiness and transition through mental health, the role that social networks, meaning both on-campus social networks, but also social networking tools and platforms play in a student's adaptation and mental health. So hopefully those would, you could think through the ways in which the campus is thinking through the issue, and maybe share one of these articles. I find that can be a very effective approach, or people tell me anecdotally it is, that they, they just give here's the abstract, read this. This might be something that we could talk about at our next meeting. And the fact that it comes from a research base means the faculty can be engaged in that. It means that people can have a conversation around what's published. So, okay. We'll go to Anne's question, Andrea.
Yeah, so Anne Coleman from Yale is asking about a little bit more about the intersection of international students, their presence on campus and campus-wide diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts, and just about resources for how folks on this call might be able to integrate those efforts a little bit more.
Yeah, certainly. So a couple things I would highlight. So ACE and AIEA just did their whole collaborative on this, and it's a treasure trove of resources if you want to look at the kinds of sessions that they provided. But I want to highlight particularly the work of Crystal George McGowie. She used to be, you might know her work, and because if you're at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, you're grieving the loss. She used to be a faculty member at UMass Amherst. She has since this year moved to George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Crystal really has been an absolutely clear voice when it comes to the intersection of DEI work and internationalization work, and examples of how that's being worked together. Maybe Anne, if you will send me an email, I do have some resources I could send you directly related to some sessions that I've been a part of with ACE on DEI work, and I can put you in touch with Crystal as well, who's done a lot of work in this area. So,
and we were actually fortunate to have her on a session for a spring immigration workshop last year as well. So she spoke about some of her research there, along with Christina Yao. So.
Oh, great! Christina Yao is the other one I was going to recommend. You would notice both of them in the U.S. Power and International Education. Both of them wrote chapters on this topic in that book. I would recommend that as a resource if you're interested in the intersections of this. In terms of DEI work, what I would say my experience has been is every campus it has its own challenges when you say that word DEIB. It's really not the same. It's not the same work. It's very different on every campus, and because what I would say is it involves the history of that campus, and all of campuses have to unpack that history and then to, I think, recognize it, reconcile it, and make choices to go in a different direction, which means changes in policy, which means changes in documents, in how you think about staffing, resources, and structure. It's a long-term project. And so I know this is an area, particularly ACE has doing a lot of work as they have updated recently ACE has updated their internationalization model to tie to issues of student success and inclusion. So we'll take yep, great, thank you, Andrea, for posting that in the chat box. And please reach out to me, Anne, if you would like. Maybe we'll do one more question, but then I want to be mindful that people do have another session to get to at 2 o'clock, and we'll end the next couple minutes here. So how about this final question, Andrea?
Yeah, so Aubrey is asking, at a recent event on campus, a university administrator voiced that she was uncertain whether asking a student if they were international was appropriate. Have you seen trends in research or best practices relating to labeling, and whether it's no longer appropriate or should be replaced with a different terminology or different practice altogether?
Yeah, so I mean, I think what you're pointing to is I think people are quite sensitized right now to the forms of microaggressions, which I always think of microaggressions. The metaphor I've used for microaggressions is they're corrosive interactions that over time corrode relationships, which means a single kind of interaction is not necessarily going to be something that is, you know, that will damage someone. But the idea that they're pervasive and they're corrosive means over time they have disastrous effects, and that's what we need to recognize. And so it's not, you know, what is there if in an instance, if someone just is, are you an international student? That instance isn't. But if that entire campus, if that's everywhere they go, that's what they experience. They're experiencing that drip, drip, drip of a corrosive, and basically it can communicate, depending on the context. It communicates you don't belong here. I mean, there's a really helpful. I saw a rather humorous kind of a video, and you've probably seen this if you've been involved in the study abroad. This "where are you from" question, right? Where are you from? Well, no, where are you really from? No, I mean, where are you from? Well, we all know that asking that question again and again and again essentially says, where are you from means you don't belong here because you're from somewhere else. Well, we're all from that. And so I think I'm not quite tuned into where people have said asking a student about being an international was inappropriate. Well, what I would say is if the pervasive campus of the culture is that is an othering way of communicating to international students, which I think if that's what they're getting every time, that's something that I think a campus would need to reconsider. The other thing I think that's important about this, Aubrey, that I would highlight is the idea that these national labels. I mean, I think we can see this in the current situation with the war with Russia and Ukraine. The idea that national labels are really even helpful descriptors of any of us is something that I think we should all call into question. Are you a United States citizen? I mean, how different are you when we think about the different microcultures that exist in our country? And actually, I wrote a chapter related to this in terms of as we think about our own identities, that this national container, this national identification it seems like it's a helpful label, but it's often a misleading label because it doesn't recognize these intersectional approaches, the many other things besides our national identity that affects us. And so what I would say probably, Aubrey, is even if it's not negative, it's like, are there other ways? I think the question I would want to say is, are there other forms of identity that we should be exploring more than reducing someone to their own their nation of citizenship or their national identity? So thank you for the nice comments everyone. I see we have more questions, but I know we're out of time. I will put my I will make sure to put this up real quick, just my final contact information. If you're interested in connecting, that would be great. We all live in the same state, same area, but my website is Chris R. Glass. I'm on Twitter at CR Glass, and you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. And then my email address I will put in the chat box is simply Chris Glass at bc.edu. And we'll look forward to staying connected. I hope it seems like you've had a great session, and I appreciate the invitation to talk with you today.
Thank you so much. This really kicks off a lot of important conversations and gets us some great places to go to be able to dig in a little further. I am just copying real quick that ACE framework that you had mentioned before that's been so useful in terms of an introductory document to further go into some of the framework that you discussed. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here. Dr. Glass, thank you so much for being part of this event and this week for us. Thank you.
I shared my slides, and there's a link in the chat box for anybody who wants to access them. So see you all later.